I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. Welcome to another episode of Women's Health Unplugged. I'm joined today by Sheva. I'm going to call you a friend. I'm going to call us, we're Instagram friends, 100%.
Please call me a friend. I feel like you're a friend. I mean, I feel like, I hope I'm your friend.
I think you invited me to your place, actually. So we're definitely friends. I'm joined today by Dr. Sheva Marcus, who is a sex therapist. We've had a podcast episode together before, which I think is probably deep in the archives at this point. And I think this is a really important conversation that we bring back up to the surface and expand upon, talking about libido, talking about desire, talking about how sex has to change as we get older. Sheva, thank you so much for spending time with me this morning. I want to dive right in. I would love if you could walk us through a little bit about, yourself, where you're at in your career. You've just published a book, which I've read, and I actually have recommended to multiple patients. I'd love if you could just walk us through where you're at in your career and who it is that you serve.
First of all, thanks for having me on. I love your podcast and I'm so happy to be here. And yes, you're one of my favorite people to follow on Instagram. As I was laughing at one point because I kept sharing your things all the time. And I was like, okay, she's going to think I'm stalking her. So I am a sex therapist. I've been a sex therapist for 30 years. This may be interesting to some of your listeners because maybe some of them can relate to this, but I grew up in a Jewish Orthodox home. So it was a pretty, religious house where sex was never talked about. And I grew up really feeling very much like I didn't get the sex education I needed and had a lot of shame around that. And also a lot of resentment around that. And, didn't actually go into sex therapy as my first field, shockingly, as you can hear, it wouldn't have, but was always kind of interested in that. And so I worked in not-for-profit for a bunch of years and then switched over through a fascinating group of events, which I could tell you, because I think it has to do with male sexual dysfunction, the pharmaceutical industry. So we could talk about how I shifted into this. But what I think has become really important to me over the years is trying to get accurate, simplified, practical information to women where they can understand the integration between the physiological and the psychological. We tend to split our mind and our body. And for so many medical issues, and you talk about this all the time, they're completely interconnected. And for sex, probably more than almost anything else that I know. And I don't know, one could argue maybe weight loss also has that same sort of interconnection between the mind and the body and how they're constantly working together. The drugs that you're on, the hormones that you're taking, the way that you use your mind, the way that you plan your life, all of those things, your psychological well-being, all of those things have a huge impact. So for 25 years, I ran the largest sexual health center in the United States. And it was the Women's Sexual Health Center and a men's sexual health center. And the Women's Sexual Health Center legally was my baby. And we saw women who had pain, problems with arousal, problems with desire, everybody's favorite, that seems to be the big concern of so many women now. And orgasm issues. And we were really successful again, because we had therapists on board, we had the medical clinicians on board. And what was complicated was that I would get calls from women all over the country and all over the world. And I wanted to bring those messages to the broader world. And that's why I wrote my book. That's why I'm getting to the book. I know the very long-winded answer, and I apologize. But so the book, Satisfaction Guaranteed, just came out in paperback. It originally was published under a different name. It was published under Sex Points, under hardcover. But the publisher decided that this was much more reflective of what people were feeling like reading it, because it was so practical, was really helping their satisfaction, and that the other name had too much of a math connotation. So it's available under Satisfaction Guaranteed, and it really is very practical guidance for how to keep your sex life alive over the years. And so I think that kind of brings us up to date, unless you want that story about how I got into the sexual world and the Viagra piece.
Well, I love that jump. You're like, that wasn't my first career. And I'm like, oh, that's so interesting. Or my first passion.
It was my first passion. It just wasn't my first career.
I want to know whose passion it isn't in their 20s, though. That's what part that I'm curious about.
It's true.
Which brings us up to talking about desire in menopause, because I do think that sometimes when people reflect back on the libido that was, right, and now the libido that isn't, it's very common for the people that I work with to point at that physiological and so it's their hormones, right? Like something's changed. There's something missing. It's like we expect, and we've talked about this before on the podcast, women expect there to be like some kind of explosion in their brain, and they want to pull over on the side of the road and have sex with their husband of 30 years. What I love about your book is that it actually does tie in all of those other aspects of libido. And when I say, when I talk about desire or whatnot with patients and I say, oh, well, this is actually quite complicated, they agree. And yet the solution they're looking for is the figurative Viagra. So I'd love if we could talk a little bit about like, why is it so complex, and what a disservice we're doing by not talking about all of those other aspects of desire and intimacy and libido.
So, I love that you said it was complex, because that ultimately is the thing I think people have to pay attention to. And in the end, or in the beginning, I built the book around, I was trying to take this idea of the fact that there are so many variables that go into a good sex life. And, somebody will come into my office and start crying inevitably and say, like, what's broken, Batsheva? Like, can we fix it? Like, I had one woman say to me, when I was in my 20s, I was good at two things, skiing and sex. Now I'm just good at skiing. So, and they want there to be an answer. And what I try to say to people is, you can't really look at sex that way. It isn't like there's an on-off switch for it. There's a lot of variables. And so the model that I use that often really resonates with people is that you need 100 points to have good sex. And those points can be coming from your own hormonal level. They could be coming from, your health, your general health. They could be coming from a new and hot partner. They could be coming from like falling in love with somebody. And those points can also be taken away by medications you're on, birth control you're on, the fact that you stop using your erotic brain and haven't really worked on keeping your fantasies alive, the fact that you have two kids banging at the door, the fact that, this person that you love is also not so new and hot anymore, right? So, when we look at all of those things together, it just changes, I think, the way that we look at sex. So the two messages, and I'm going to start with this one, and then I'll jump in the other. One message is like, let's look at an analogy. And I always think building an analogy makes it clearer for people. So, you take somebody, Samantha, she's 18 years old. She's walking around. She's not super stressed with her life right now. It's not terribly stressful. She's got 90 points from her own hormone levels. She's in great health. She can meet some guy. Samantha can meet a guy at a bar and go into the scuzzy bathroom in the back and probably have great sex, because she only needs 10 points to get her to that 100-point threshold, right? And now Samantha goes off, and it's 5 years later, and Samantha's like 23, and she meets this hot new guy. I'm going to call him Keanu Reeves. I always use Keanu Reeves as my hot guy. Tells you a lot about me. Anyway, so she's getting 20 points because it's hot and new and erotic. She falls in love with Keanu Reeves. She's got 20 more points. Samantha is walking around with 130 points. She is great. If Keanu Reeves leaves crumbs all over the kitchen, or if she and Keanu Reeves have a little bit of a fight, or if work gets stressful, she's losing 20 points, it doesn't matter. She's way over that 100 threshold, and she is good to go, right? Now it's 10 years later, and she still loves Keanu Reeves, but they have two kids banging at the door, and that takes away 20 points. It's hot, not so hot, new and erotic anymore. And, she hasn't really been thinking about sex much. And now she's down to 90 points, and her sex life is not working for her. And she's really not happy. And this is where like she could walk into her gynecologist or her primary care and say, my sex life is terrible. And I don't want to have sex anymore. I'm not interested in sex anymore. And more than often than not, she'll get well, how was it when you were on vacation? And she'll be like, oh, actually it was okay on vacation. So then therefore it must be psychological, not physiological, right? But she doesn't live on vacation, and that's not a helpful solution for her. And she needs to figure out where to get her extra 10 points now, today, when she's at home. And I'm saying to women, those points are there. We just need to sit down together and understand where to get them from. And that may be a new toy. It may be more time with your spouse. It may be looking at your birth control pills. Who knows? It may be making sure that there's a lock on your door. It may be learning to use your erotic brain differently than you've used in the past. We can get you, but you need to start thinking about your sex life as having many, many variables and being impacted positively and negatively, and often negatively as you get older sometimes. And I want to talk about that. And not realizing how in control it is for you to look at all these other variables to bring points back in. So I think that's a better model for women as they're thinking about their sex life. The first thing you need to understand is that you have more in control than you think you have in control, but you do need to understand that it's not one thing that's broken, that it may be a group of variables that you need to look at. And, I built the book so that you can then, if this feels like your problem, is chapter 8, 10, and 12. It's a little like choose your own adventure, because everybody's a little different. So, so that was point number one. Point number one is that it's very variable, and you got to look at a lot of variables. And point number two, which I will now shut up for a second, so I can get a breath in and you can say something, is about how your sex life is just changing all the time.
Yeah. And I do want to get into that, because as you were talking, first of all, my first question was, is it Speed Keanu Reeves or is it the Matrix Keanu Reeves? I feel like they're very different.
That is so interesting. I'm thinking the Matrix Keanu Reeves.
Yeah, I feel like it's the Matrix as well.
For me, it's the Matrix Keanu Reeves.
Yeah, it's the Matrix Keanu Reeves. But as you were going through that and talking about, those different stages, it's interesting because we're not as aware of some of those pieces that were working in your favor when it was good, right? And so then, and I also think we're not as aware of some of the things that are not working in our favor as things don't get good, or as they get bad, I guess. And that leads to this sense of a loss of control, I think, in patients, where they don't know why it was good before, because we don't have good discussions around libido and sex when things are good. And now they don't know why it's not good. But again, you don't have good places to turn. If they turn to their primary care provider, their primary care provider also probably has a shitty sex life. And so they probably go, you know what, we're all getting older. This is just how it is.
Do you know how often I hear that? Do you know how often I hear that? I talked to my doctor and she said, well, that's just the way it is. I'm like, are you fucking kidding? Am I allowed to say that on here? Are you kidding me?
Yeah. I know. And I feel like that honestly just speaks volumes to how we talk about so many health conditions, right? Oh, you're getting older, congratulations, it's over. And so, but that loss of control leads people to feel like there is something outside of themselves that needs to be the solution and not themselves. But also that entire piece around, we don't talk about it enough all the way along. So people aren't, they're not aware of their own influence on their own sex life, that then when we come in with the solution of hey, did you want to get a vibrator? That feels like either, I can't believe you're asking me about this, right? There's that shame, embarrassment piece. But also, oh shit, I lost my train of thought. It's they had never considered that there is a thing that they are in control of. And that's almost even scary, especially if there's intimacy challenges, or if maybe they don't even want to have a good sex life with the person they're supposed to have a good sex life with.
There's so many thoughts here.
There's a lot there.
There's so much there. We should unpack it. So the things I want to talk about are this idea of loss of control, this idea that your sex life is not static. It's constantly changing. And I feel like we have this myth that we learn how to have sex and then it just continues for the rest of our life that way. And nothing could be further from the truth. Your sex life is, okay. So I want to talk about that. And I really want to talk about this idea that you have to work on your sex life as opposed to this magic pixie dust that lands on you. So where should we start, Jordan?
Let's start with the pixie dust.
Okay. So I think part of what happens, especially when you talk about desire for women, is that they remember this golden age of, it could be literally an age like 18 to 22, or it could be early in relationships when it feels like desire is just, it's not something you have to even look at or work at. It just evolves on you. It just pops into you, it just falls on in your lap. And then people think, oh, that's how a sex life is supposed to be. And nothing could be further from the truth. Like long-term monogamous sex lives, which many people want, involve a lot of work and planning, and they can be incredibly, incredibly fulfilling. And there's so many good things about it, and we can talk about it. But I think people have this idea that it's supposed to be something that happens to you, not something that you do, which goes back to this control, right? It's when a woman comes in and she has no libido, Jordan, like, you and I we're talking about this before. Like sometimes women come in and they have no libido and they want to fix it because of their husband, because he still has a libido, right? And I totally get where they're coming from, because if you don't want something, it's hard to want something you don't want, right? Right? It's like hard. It's like you have no appetite, but you're trying to like want the food. So I understand where they're coming from. And what my job often is with these women is to work with them to remember how much more alive they may have felt when they had a libido, right? Because often just with a little bit of space to think about it, most women will say to you, when I wanted sex, when I was having sex, I felt more alive, more in touch with my body, just more happy in the world. I just move around the world feeling more confident and more alive. And relationships are fundamentally different when there is a sex life in there. And, I do not feel like everybody has to be having sex. If you're somebody who doesn't want to have sex and your partner doesn't have sex and you're both really happy about that, more power to you. I'm not one of these people who feels like everybody has to live a certain way, but there's no question in my mind that the tenor of relationships changes so dramatically when there is a good sex life there. And, I'll often say to people, Jordan, I'll say, like, I did not go into this field because I'm so fascinated by body part A and where it fits into body part B, although that is interesting. And I would love to talk about that. But body part A and body part B have a limited amount of interest to me. What I am fascinated by and never cease to be amazed by is how fundamentally the nature of relationships change when the sex is good. And, you see it when women will say, if I find his socks on the floor, and we've had good sex recently, I can laugh and scoop them up and throw them in the hamper. But if we haven't, I want to pick them up and shove them in his mouth. Do you know what I mean? Like I just, so wanting sex and wanting to have a sex life. And I feel like it can be reclaimed. And I think once women kind of become aware of the fact that it's more in control, but that it does involve some work, it makes all the difference in the world.
So when women say, I want to treat my libido, and, when I ask them questions about that, and it comes out that they feel like they're doing it for their partner, like what is the underlie there? Like, is there another meaning? Is there, like, how do we explore that with women in a way that's safe, that allows them to say the things they need to say? Because sometimes for me, like I would say that that's a challenge, right? Because like, it's like when someone says they want to lose weight for their partner, like I really get my back up about that when I'm in clinic, and I want to throw the table over and be like, there's no way we're working on this just for someone else, right? Like I really want to do it for you. Except I would say with both of those topics, we're talking about a woman's relationship with herself, with her body, with her sexuality. And maybe like what I hear is, I want to have a better sex life because my partner has a higher libido than I do, but maybe the meaning is different. I don't know. What do you think?
So I'll tell you the first thing that I think when that happens, and I just had a client like this. I was talking to her yesterday. She came in a couple months ago. They're hopeless. Like they don't really believe they can fix it. And I think that's really big, right? Like they feel this sense. This client said to me yesterday, but Sheva, if you had told me 3 months ago that I could feel the way I'm feeling, that our sex life would be where it is right now, 3 months ago, 3 months, that's not very long, Jordan, right? Like that's, she said, I would have told you were crazy. And it's true. When she first came to see me, she was like, I'm done. I have zero interest. nothing's working right. Not my brain, not my vagina, nothing's working right. And, but I don't, and that's it. Like the question, but I don't really want that part of my life to be over. And so the question is when a patient says to you, like, I don't want it, but for my partner, my work, I don't know if you have time, because you spend a lot of time on a lot of things with your patients, but like, I totally get it. First, the most important thing is to understand where they're coming from, because right now they don't want to have sex. It's not interesting to them. It feels like it's going to be work, and they don't really believe, none of us want to do work if we don't really think it's going to help. Right. And I think they don't really believe it's going to be help. Right. Like it is, weight loss is an interesting comparison, because like, if you've been on 17,000 eating plans and diets and they've all failed, you just don't want to do it again. Right. Like, so if a woman feels like she's doomed to failure, and it's never, like, it feels like a mountain that's just not climbable, then that's going to be her reaction. I don't really want to do it. I'm only doing it for my partner. And then the work is also, like, as I said, like going back and trying to say, well, was there a time in your life when you did like sex? What did that feel like? Because for most women, that's where you can get in, where they'll say, yes, I loved that. I loved flirting. I loved being connected to my sexual self. That was like, I love that, but I don't really believe it's going to be possible to get that back. And so I think that's sort of the big, those two, the hopelessness that it may not be being expressed, and also kind of reminding them what it felt like to want sex.
Yeah, I feel like that's such a good reminder for me, and also for clinicians listening, right? That, like, I think, I truly will be challenged by that particular, like, reason why I don't want people to do anything for anybody else ever, right? Like, I mean, certainly, like, you want to think about your family and your partner and whatnot, but I really want women to latch onto their goals for themselves, because I do think that unless we have this performance goal inside of ourselves, again, whatever we're talking about, weight loss or strength or sex life, that it's fleeting, right? Like, our commitment to change is quite fleeting if we're not doing it for ourselves.
So I want to add something, because I feel like we live a little bit in a time, Jordan, and I'm curious how you feel about this, where we're very anti anybody ever doing anything for anybody else. And honestly, no, seriously, like, you can't lose weight for somebody else. You know what I'm saying? You can't lose weight for somebody else. Honestly, you can't change your libido for somebody else either. However, you can say, this is a value that's important to my partner, and so I'm going to try to fix it because it's important to me also to make my partner happy. So, like, the analogy I'll sometimes use is, like, you can ever imagine any couple where the woman complains that the husband's not good at communicating, right? You never heard of any woman ever complain that her husband is not a good communicator, right? So but if the husband was like, I'm a terrible communicator, I'm not interested in changing it, right? It's not really important to me, but you would say it's perfectly legitimate for your wife to say it's important to her. And so let's go on this journey together. Now, that doesn't mean that over time he's not going to sort of hopefully see the advantages to it. And he wants to connect with his wife, right? So he's going to work on that aspect. And so, when a woman comes in and says, look, I really have so little libido right now that I just don't care if I never have sex again, but I know it's destroying my relationship. To my mind, that's not a bad reason to come in. I just need to work with her to find the motivators for her, back to your point, because it's not going to work long-term unless she can figure out what's really going on for her. How do you feel about that?
Yeah. And I'm glad that you, like, stopped there and kind of said that in a better way than what I was saying, because you're right. Like, we also could see it as a gift to your relationship, right? And that's not doing it for someone else. That's doing it for the betterment of the entire ecosystem of your relationship. But I do think that there has to be some element of desire in the woman in order for things to be better. Because, like I said, I think it's fleeting otherwise, because the things we're going to ask her to do is not take a pill, right? It's way more beyond that. And if she can't get connected to showing up for her libido all the time, then the likelihood of her being successful is pretty low. So I want her to feel connected to the goal. I guess that's what I was trying to say.
Yes. And I think, it's like when you feel like you don't want something intellectually, so maybe we should split that down. Intellectually, you can want to fix something, and then we can help you try to work to get that so that you actually feel that you want it. And that's its own animal.
hmm So let's talk a little bit about just that, how sex needs to change. Because that is something else I think that is deserves conversation, especially as women hit midlife and start moving into perimenopause and towards menopause. That, that same like missionary sex that you've had with your husband from 30 years, that needs to evolve over time. And I feel like that's such an interesting conversation, especially when we look at like, who is in menopause right now and who is approaching that age. I think their sex education was incomplete, we'll call it.
Abysmal.
And and coming forward with some of those ideas, right, around like how sex needs to change can be even a barrier in the conversation. But what do we know about that right now around why sex needs to change as we change and as we get older?
Well, the first thing we need to know is that it does change, right? Like, I feel like that is like, I'm always going around saying your sex life is not static. The moment your sex life is static, you are doomed, right? But for some reason, that is exactly, it's so countercultural. We have all been inculcated with this message that we learn how to have sex. Hopefully it goes well, not for everybody, but assuming it goes well, it's going to look like that for the next, 50 years or whatever it is, and hopefully longer. Can you imagine if I handed you a dress and I said, this is your dress, it's perfect right now, and this is what you're going to wear for the rest of your life. It doesn't matter if the styles change or you get taller or you gain weight or lose weight or the elbows get like, it doesn't work that way. And sex doesn't work that way either. But what happens is when you think that way, as soon as you hit a roadblock, you're all done, right? But as you get older, your hormones shift, the medications you on are shifts, the way that you're working shifts, your family shifts, your relationship with your spouse shifts, your time, the way you're spending your time shifts, like all those things, and your partner's on different medications, and your partner pulls their back out and you hit your knees, and all of these things are going to be an impact. And if you go into your sex life with the understanding that it is constantly shifting and constantly changing, then when you hit a road bump, you think to yourself, oh, something's coming up now with our sex life. It's not working so well. Let's get help. I can maybe get that help myself, and maybe some books, maybe my physician will help me. Maybe I need a therapist, whatever it is, or maybe we just need a freaking conversation about it, me and my partner. Then you'll be like, oh, let's just shift it, right? Like, this position isn't working for me anymore. Like, it doesn't work for me. It's harder for me to have an orgasm now. Do you know what I mean? Any of those things start to change. And so as soon as you shift your mindset to say, I am not supposed to have this free flowing sex life that just keeps, meandering along like the princess riding off with the prince, but my sex life is going to be constantly, constantly shifting and changing. Then all of a sudden it doesn't sound so scary when things happen, I laugh because people often think, because I'm a sex therapist, like, oh, my sex life has always been perfect. And I open the book by talking about all of the road bumps I've had over the years and how much my sex life has shifted and changed. And, I think that understanding that is part one. And then, so let's start with that.
And I like your analogy there of like, even like the dress like could, just not be trendy, right? It like not only does it not fit in 10 years, but maybe it's no longer trendy. And I think, sex is one of these areas of medicine that we're very slow to uptake on the research, actually making it into the public practice, right? So we've learned so much about vaginal moisture and the microbiome, and we've learned about local vaginal estrogen for supporting. And by the time I'm inundating a patient with, okay, there's lube, okay, there's moisturizer, okay, there's HRT, and then, okay, let's talk about like blood flow changes and the impact that a vibrator or, different mechanisms of stimulation may have on your sex life. It's almost met like this isn't medicine moving forward. Do you know what I mean? Whereas like in cardiology, could you imagine if we were like, no, we're like, this is the drug that we used 50 years ago and we're still going to use it now, even though there's a better solution out there. Like, it's almost like we look at sex as if it's not part of medicine and that it's not evolved and that it doesn't have better solutions than we had 10 years ago, when that's absolutely not the case.
So much has changed. I mean, it is so, it's like a whole world. I feel like the last 20 years in women's sexual health has just been an explosion of it seems to me now, maybe because I'm sitting in the middle of it, because I know there's still a lot of women who have trouble getting help, but that doctors are a lot more responsive to pain issues. The fact that, perimenopause and menopausal women just need something in their vagina to keep their vagina working well for them. Understanding more about neuroplasticity and how your brain works and your fantasy life, as you said about vibrators. I think here's a really interesting piece, which I feel like women maybe aren't paying attention to, but that when I say your sex life takes work and planning, it gets people's backs up a little bit, right? Like when I say, like, I often talk about scheduling sex, and I think we should spend some time because I feel like for long-term monogamous relationships, you freaking need to schedule sex. So I definitely want to get back to that. But when I was talking about that and talking about some of the planning and the work involved, somebody said to me, oh my God, it was funny. I was on a podcast. Somebody said to me, it sounds like you're talking about exercise, like finding the thing you like to do. And my first reaction, this was years ago, was actually my podcast. And my first reaction was like, oh, no, I'm not at all like talking about exercise. And then afterwards, Jordan, I was thinking about it. I'm like, you know what? It's exactly like exercise. There are many nights you do not want to get your ass off that sofa to go do something, but that when you do, you feel so good. And that if you have planned regular exercise into your life, the tenor of your life changes dramatically. And that if you find something that you like to do physically, it makes getting off the sofa much easier. That's still not going to mean that you're always going to want to get off that sofa. But I feel like if you're somebody who has learned to embrace movement and exercise in your life as something that makes you feel alive and vibrant and happy, and it's a regular part of your life, it's a great analogy for sex because, and then people hear that and they're like, oh, no, but sex is supposed to be this magic pixie dust. It's back to the magic pixie dust, right? It's supposed to be something that we innately want to do without thinking about it. Well, that is really a fairy tale for anybody in a long-term monogamous relationship. And yet you hear how important I think sex is in a long-term relationship. So you need to like wrap your head around the fact that it is going to take work. It is going to take planning. And I'm sorry if that doesn't fit the fairy tale, but it's worth it in the end. If you have a really good ongoing sex life, it's just worth it. It makes you feel happy the same way getting off the sofa that first few times and going to your Zumba class started making you feel happy.
I once had a patient say that sex was exactly like exercise. She's like, you don't really want to go. And then you're like kind of happy that you were there. And then you feel way better when it's over.
Right. So I would love to hear that like a little, right. I guess I would like it to flip a little more joyfully, like that you're not pushing yourself so hard and you're really enjoying what you're doing. And when I hear women who get to the point where like they're trying things and they still are really pushing themselves really hard, that's when I tend to look at the hormones. I think that's an important piece, but for many, many women, that's not the case. And also just to your point, because I think this is really important. When you give a woman hormones, which I think can often help get the brain kind of in gear, you have to change the behavior. Like if you don't change the behavior, the hormones are going to do diddly squat, right? It's kind of like if you give a guy Viagra and then he goes to a basketball game and he doesn't do anything to get himself turned on, the Viagra is not going to work, right? So that's why I get sometimes frustrated to hear doctors say, well, I give them testosterone and it doesn't do anything. And I'm like, well, because you're only giving them testosterone and the behavior and the way they think has to change.
And what does that look like at the beginning, Batsheva? What does thinking differently and behaving differently actually look like in that day to day, right? Because I think, even as a listener, they're going like, okay, well, I get up, I get my kids ready, I go to work, I come home, I make dinner, I unpack all of the Tupperware from everybody's freaking lunch bags. And
you're not talking about your life, Jordan, right?
No, actually, my husband undoes all of the Tupperware. I would just leave them in the backpacks and then find them like a month later. So bless him, he does it. But I think as you're thinking about like, well, when we're saying, well, your mind has to change, your behavior has to change, like, what does that look like? How does that show up in a day? Is it as simple as flirting and holding hands and, going a little bit out of the norm to show appreciation and love for your partner? Or is there something more to it?
So obviously there's a lot of different ways, but let me talk about two that I think could be very practical for anybody listening to this. So one is, and I'm going to get back to the scheduling sex, I have to tell you, like, if there's a non-negotiable in long-term relationships, it's scheduling sex. And I laugh sometimes because I'll be talking to a couple who's in a long-term relationship, have sex, and we'll be talking about scheduling, and they'll hear about it, and they're like, well, we don't schedule. And I'll be like, oh, okay. So like, when do you have sex? And they'll say something like, oh, well, we just always have sex on the weekend. Like, or they'll say, I don't know, like usually not more than 4 or 5 days go by without us having sex. Like, of course they're scheduling it. It's not like they pulled out a planner and they've written it down, but they have scheduled it. And that's, a really good place to be, where the scheduling just feels very natural. But for couples who are re-exploring their sex life or trying to reignite their sex life, I go full on, pull out that planner and schedule the sex, like, because there's so many things going on in your life and you're getting pulled in so many directions. And if you don't plan it, it is not going to happen. And my brother was laughing. He heard me on a podcast once where somebody said, well, that's not very sexy, pulling out. And I was like, what's really not sexy? Not having sex, right? That's even way more not sexy. So my brother called me and said, I woke up this morning to your voice saying that, really. Anyway, but I think for couples getting past that, again, it's supposed to be this fairy pixie dust, and saying, scheduling time for the two of us to have naked time together, to really have time to focus on each other in a physical way, is without question probably the most important message. And there's different ways to handle that. I talk about that a lot in the book, but again, if your back gets up with that, then you can think of different ways to do it that may be more subtle, that might work better for you. But if you don't consciously pick a time and basically a time and a space for you guys to have sex, it is just never going to happen. It's just too easy for it to fall off the radar screen. So that's number one. And that feels really like, non-negotiable. The other thing I want to talk about is women's erotic brains and how we let those slowly disappear. Can I go into that?
Yes, please.
Okay. So we are understanding a lot more about neuroplasticity, right? We get that if you don't use a piece of your brain, it shuts down. It just shuts down. The neurotransmitters stop, blasting off, and there's less blood flow in the area, and, the synapses aren't going the way they used to go. And so if you talk French and you talk French all the time, your French is going to be really good. And then if you stop talking French for 5 years or 10 years and you try to talk French, that French is going to be really rusty, and it's going to feel really awkward, and you're going to have to break your teeth getting that French out. But once you've used the French for a while, your French is going to come back. And it will be easier to learn Spanish. That's what we're learning about our brain, right? Like the neuroplasticity part, your brain is extremely efficient. It shuts down the parts that you're not using, right? It doesn't kill them. It just quiets them down, and they're just not there. They're just like, basically the lights are off. So what I have discovered with a lot of women is that they have just let the lights turn off in the erotic part of their brain. Again, during the easy part of the relationship, either early on when their hormones are coursing like crazy and it's a brand new partner, they're not working on those things. So they don't think that's something that they need to pay attention to, but you need to pay attention to that. And it's possible. It really is possible to get that going again. And I'm happy to talk about it. I just feel like I'm like going on and on and on and on. So
no, and I'm curious how, like, I think that would probably be the next like logical piece, is like, how do women turn that part of their brain back on?
So the first thing is to acknowledge that you need to get it turned on. And then I have a number of different ways I want to get women started. Usually it involves some that kind of external, using something external, like reading erotica, watching erotica, listening to erotica. And that's something women, they get very nervous, and the erotica porn, I use those back and forth. I just use erotica because it makes people less nervous. I use the word, but, and different people like different kinds of things, but there's no question that is extremely helpful to women to start getting themselves turned on. Because I want them to ultimately move it to their own brain and not need the external stimulation, but to start by watching something that turns them on, reading something that turns them on, or listening to something that turns them on. And there's Dipsy, so Dipsy, it's an app that has just erotic stories. It's done really well. It has actors acting out the stories. You can pick if you want something kind of vanilla or you want something wild and kinky. You could pick if you want women only. You can pick if you want group sex. You can, you know what I mean? You can romantic, tie them up, however you want, you pick. And so for women, I find often listening is a really powerful thing, as is just listening to sounds of sex. Like just Google sounds of sex and listening to the people having sex. Often for women, every woman is really different, but where it's pretty clear that men tend to lean towards the visual, getting turned on by the visual. Some women actually do, but some women find that harder and find it much easier to get into their heads when they're listening or reading. You know, when 50 Shades of Grey came out, Jordan, like, oh my God, I cannot tell you, right? So the first thing to do is to like access something that allows you to get turned on again. And I know, again, the women who come in who feel like they're so gone, feel like nothing's going to turn them on. But if you give yourself some space and time, usually that's not the case. And then the really critical elements are using it on a regular basis. And I'm going to talk about that in a second, and not judging yourself. Those are like the two biggest lessons. So should I keep going?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, because I'm like a speeding train, and you can't even get a word in edgewise.
No, this is okay. You go.
Okay, so you know, people think of using this erotica to get themselves turned on to have sex, and I'm saying I want you to use the erotica to get your erotic brain going, so that you can access it when you want, and it's just part of your life. And so I'll often say to women, I want you to find something that turns you on. If there's a story that turns you on or something, read it for 2 or 3 minutes in the morning. You know, you don't have to find new things, often the same thing. I want you to do it in the morning. And then during the course of the day, if you notice yourself in any way reacting to a picture, to an ad, to a person, you're feeling that little flutter, pay attention and foster it. Don't speed right over it, right? Like, I want you to start feeling erotic feelings at different times during the day. Like, that's what I want, because we're trying to help you feel more connected to your sexual self, right? So when 50 Shades of Grey came out, it's very funny. I always thought this was funny. There was a woman who was coming from very far to see me to Manhattan, and she said, oh, I had 50 Shades of Grey, but I didn't read it on the way down here because, like, I'm not going to have sex, right? Like, I should read it right before I have sex. And I'm like, no, you can read it right before you have sex. That's great if you feel like it helps you. But what we're trying to do is get yourself as turned on as often as you can, because think about that part of your brain again. When that part of your brain is firing the way it needs to fire, you can use it and you can inhabit it, and it's there for you when you want it. So you have to stop thinking about the sex as just being this thing that happens with you and your partner in this room, or you and yourself in this room. You have to think about it as something where you are becoming a more sexual being. So that's one, is like using it at different times during the day. And two, this is a biggie, stop freaking judging yourself. Like, it is the number of women who come in and say things to me like, I can't fantasize because when I fantasize, I find myself thinking about other women and I'm not a lesbian. And I'm like, okay, you're not a lesbian, but it turns you on to think about other women. That's why it's called a fantasy. You're not going out and doing it, right? Or a huge one, Jordan, is I have fantasies about like being overtaken, like somebody climbing in the window and ravaging me. How could I be? That's awful. That's terrible. I'm like, it's a freaking fantasy. Like, where in our society have we lost the ability to separate between fantasy and reality? Like, the whole joy of a fantasy is it's not something that you necessarily want to have it happen. It just turns you on in your head. And that is such a gift. Like, what else do we have besides our fantasy that is no cost, no calories, really very little effort once you get going, right? Like, and it brings so much joy, right? And, you know, that I'll call it a rape fantasy. I don't know how that triggers people. So I'm careful with the language, but you know, it's such a classic example because so many women love the fantasy of being overtaken. Like, that really turns them on in a big way. And I'll be like, you are creating the person who's climbing in your window. You are telling that person what to say. You are making, you decide exactly what that person looks like. You know exactly when that person needs to stop, and that person or people or group or whatever stops exactly when you want it. Who the hell is controlling that? There's no resemblance to anything in real life where there would be it would be a horrible situation. So I think women have to stop judging their fantasies, whether it's about other women, whether it's about a group, whether it's something that feels degrading, whether it's something that's incredibly romantic, even though they don't see themselves that way, like whether it's something very feminine and they feel like that. In all of these things, we get in our own way with the fantasies. And when you can allow women to really embrace them, it just changes everything.
I think that's such an important point. And it really, like, when we go back through the conversation, there's been these little points of like, there's judgment, there's lack of education, and then there's this, acknowledgement of how complex this whole piece is. And I think we've done such a good job at touching on all of those little pieces. Like, it would be impossible for you to have listened to this point and be like, no, I still want the Viagra, right? Like, I think you can see, like, by this point in the conversation that there are so many parts of your life that are influencing. I love that word you use, tenor. Like, where can you just say, like, explain what you mean by that, like the tenor of your life? Because I'm interpreting it in one way, but I want to hear how you think of that word when you are using it.
Okay. And I would then love to hear what you think also, but I'm talking about a vitality and of presence and I'm almost crying as I'm talking to you about it because I feel like so passionately about this, like inhabiting your body in the world. It feels different when you are comfortable with your sexuality and when you feel like your sexuality is alive and you can experience it. And I feel like, it's almost like music. Like where would life be with no music, right? And it's not just, you don't want to just sort of sit and listen to music. It's the music that just flows through you. And that is how I feel like your sexuality is so fundamental to who we are. Like there's a reason that more poetry and stories and songs have been written about sex than anything else, because it's not just an extra thing. It's not something you just do in the bedroom, right? It's a piece of who we are. And that's what I mean about the tenor of your life and your relationship.
Yeah. And that's how I thought of it as well, right? I was like, I just took the tenor, tone, like that vitality piece. And it's interesting. I think if we can level up that piece, our tolerance of not living there also starts to go down. Right. And I've noticed that even about myself, as, exercise or whatever it is, as those things become incorporated into my life as non-negotiables, I feel 110% all the time. Like I am like the total man cold woman because I just don't tolerate not feeling amazing. And when you were saying that word, like that tenor of your life, that made me think of that like, if we can just if we brought more women up to that sense of like things being on fire, right? Like in all aspects of their life, not just their sex life, but like life in general, how good it would be. Right. And I think either women I don't know if they don't feel deserving or they don't feel like it's possible or they feel hopeless or they don't even know what they're missing because they've never lived up there. That's part of why I like having these conversations, because you can kind of like, intimately listen to possibility, right? That's what's so neat about podcasting is that nobody knows. When you're talking about 50 Shades of Grey, I was remembering when I saw it in Costco, I actually had no idea what the book was about. This is back when it first came out. It was like in big stacks in Costco and people were like avoiding the like display like a plague. And I didn't know why. I'm like, oh, there's that book that everybody seems to be talking about. And I like walked around with my 50 Shades of Grey under my arm so proudly. I'm like, I'm going to be this cultured reader who's reading this new book that's out. And then it was only later where I was like, oh, like, I guess apparently I should have been embarrassed about that, but I had no idea.
Well, you shouldn't have been embarrassed.
No, and I agree.
Right, exactly. But it is because it was BDSM related. It made women feel like somehow, but they all loved it. Not all, but a lot of women loved it, but they felt ashamed about loving it. And like, where did we go wrong that we shame people for their fantasies? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think that last piece is really important because it's like almost like just opening that last little door around like, that erotic brain. And that's a part that it's hard for women to maybe access on their own. And they probably need support and they probably need a book and they probably need to talk to someone about it. Because even if we're talking about this and this is making your spine crawl, or you're thinking, oh my God, if my mother knew that I was listening to this podcast, she would die. Right. That's like the signal, right? That needs more support, obviously, in the whole equation. But I'd love to hear. I mean, you and I, honestly, I feel like we could talk for like, 2 days about this. What's your like lasting words, Sheva, for the audience? Like, what do you want to leave them with? Also, I want to just circle back on your book and make sure that people know where to find you. What are your lasting sort of thoughts there for the audience?
My lasting thoughts are, remember well that your sex life is not static. It's always changing and that you can make it better. Like I want women to know that no matter how hopeless you feel, no matter how long it's been, no matter how dead you're feeling inside, you can, I promise you, I promise you, you can make it better. And I want to give you hope. I mean, that's ultimately really the message I want to give women.
Amazing. And where can they find your book right now?
So it's on all, Amazon, Barnes and Nobles. It's, it's called Satisfaction Guarantees. You can always go guaranteed. Sorry, how to have the sex you've always wanted. It's, you can go to my website, Dr. Batsheva, and find it there. You can go to my Instagram and which is where I met Jordan. It was so fun. Instagram or TikTok and at Dr. Batsheva, DrBatsheva. Although to be fair, on TikTok, I got thrown off. So I'm now under the Dr. Batsheva. So same idea. I know. Can you imagine I got thrown off? I am so conservative, it's so ridiculous. Anyway, I would love people's feedback about the book because it was really what do you call it? I wrote it because I wanted to get the message out there, and I love to hear from people who have read it and used it and have thoughts.
Yeah. And that's one of the things I love about you. Your impact goals are huge, right? You are very generous with your information, with your expertise, and with your time. I love your Instagram. We'll link all of these things in the show notes. So if you're listening, you're only one click away, but grab a copy of the book. I've read it and I highly recommend. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Thank you so much for having me, Jordan.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. We're changing things in women's health. One episode, one topic, one conversation at a time. I want you to feel confident in your health. Please remember that the podcast does not constitute a medical relationship or medical advice. Please talk to your family doctor, your practitioner, your specialist, or anyone on your health team if you think some of the topics we discussed in today's episode apply to you. Take care of yourself. Until next time.